to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll talk about some exciting stuff about attack and defense. And not all attacks win. Well, I'd like to share with you two classic examples by the first official world champion, William Steinitz. And the first game that we're about to see is played in a consultation game, which is a cool thing to do that is not done much lately. But I think it would be worth reviving that idea that a grandmaster plays with an amateur player or with a less accomplished player in consultation or with alternate moves versus another grandmaster and another amateur or less accomplished player. The particular game we're about to see is being played by Chigorin and Pons versus William Steinitz and Gavil in Havana, Cuba in 1889. That's a long time ago. And they have reached this position at one point in the game where it was White's turn. It's quite clear that Black has started an attack on the king side, despite the fact that it's on the same side where his king has castled as well. Although it's quite clear that the black king is in no danger whatsoever, having the two black rooks and queen right around it, and white doesn't have too many pieces left, period, but none of them can really attack the black king. The black king is completely safe, and it is the white king that is having a lot of unpleasant moments. In the current position, Black is threatening to combine the various elements in the position, starting with the pin along the A7 G1 diagonal, the pressure along the F file that's being put towards the F2 pawn, and potentially opening the G file to take advantage of the current positioning of the black rook. So if it was Black's turn, or for example if White would make an ignorant move, let's say A4, Black would continue by playing G4, chasing that bishop away, and then would have a very pleasant choice of capturing the pawn on F2 or E4, but probably most precisely would play G3 first to try to capture that pawn, perhaps with a pawn, or put pressure also on the H2 pawn, with the idea that if pawn takes pawn, then already with the H file open and the white king ending up there very soon, the black queen could appear on H6 and decide the game to his favor very quickly. Well, let's go back to the starting position and see what's the story here. Let me first show you what happened in the game, and then we'll come back again to the starting position to talk just a bit more about what could have happened. Chigorin and his partner Pons continued here by playing H3 in hopes to prevent Black's advancement of the G pawn to G4. Also, if Black would try to bring help with the second pawn to H5, that's conveniently guarded by the white light-squared bishop. So at first it seems that White is in good shape and is away from trouble. Unfortunately for White, things weren't quite as they first seem. Black now can proceed very aggressively and successfully in just a few moves win the game. Try to think and maybe play out this position yourself with a friend or with one of your silicon friends. After you come back, here is a solution on how Steinitz and his partner won the game in just 6 moves from here. They continued by playing G4 anyway, giving the pawn up. If the bishop would capture the pawn, besides capturing on F2, an even better move is to first sacrifice the rook for the bishop, and if White would accept the sacrifice, then already rook would capture on F2, creating all kind of super dangerous double checks, such as rook captures rook or discovered check, rook d2. And if white would capture, then after capture, the checkmate comes immediately along the h file. Let's go back again to the game continuation. After g4, therefore, white captured the pawn with the pawn, not the bishop. And now, amazingly, black's attack is very quick, and white never gets the time to recuperate or to get his sleeping pieces, the rook in the corner on a1, or even the queen, to optimally participate in the defense. Black continued by playing h5, renewing that same idea that the pawn will capture on g4 and then use the pin by playing g3. For example, after a move like queen d2, that's exactly what black would do, following it up with g3, and after a bishop or a black pawn ends up on f2, the white king will be forced to move to the h file, which is widely open right now for either the black queen or rook to get to and checkmate white's king. Again, let's go back. After h5, Chigorin tried his best, keeping the position as much closed as possible, the various files, and played g5. Unfortunately, it delays the end but doesn't really change the result. After rook g5, now there is a pin along the g file where black is immediately threatening to capture white's bishop. In the game, white moved out of that pin but cannot stay out of trouble for long because rook h4 came, king g1, and black just makes a number of very powerful attacking moves against which white is quite helpless. Now, of course, checkmate threat comes immediately on h2. Playing g3 doesn't help anything because the pin still exists along the a7 g1 diagonal, and therefore black would simply capture on g3 immediately with the queen. And playing rook e1, which white did in the game, seems to help because now after queen h2, the white king would successfully run away. However, black has another beautiful combination to end the game immediately. And that is, can you see that? And that is rook g2. And now if bishop takes, there is checkmate in one move, or after king takes, there is checkmate in two moves, therefore white resigned. A very powerful attack and brilliant way of playing by Steinitz. Let's go back to the starting position and talk a little bit about the position, what white should have done. As so often said, it's not healthy to stay in pins. And this is no exception from that common rule. The best that white could have done here is king h1. Although it's not as good as analysts claimed back in those times and in elder books, that they claimed that king h1 would have avoided most of the trouble. But nevertheless, it certainly would have prolonged the game quite significantly. Now, black would continue, of course, with g4, forcing the bishop back, and now black has a choice to win a pawn or capture a pawn in various ways. Capturing the pawn on f2 with the rook is probably the least attractive one because white would simply trade rooks and then capture black's pawn on g4. Capturing the pawn on f2 with the bishop perhaps is the second best move. Then white would continue with g3. Black captures the second pawn and would play king g2, trying to use the pin on the bishop, and after rook protects the bishop, white would win at least one of the pawns back and would have decent chances to save the game. Let's go back again. So, after king h1, the best move, g4, bishop e2. In this position, black's objectively best choice is to capture the pawn on e4. And now white could play f3, pawn takes, bishop takes, and here analysis thought that white has a pretty good game, but in reality black still has an advantage, although not an immediately winning one, after rook h4, which immediately threatens with a checkmate in 2 with a sacrifice on h2. White could play, of course, h3, preventing that. And then black could play queen f5, renewing the threat of sacrificing either the rook or the queen on h3 and checkmate in 2. White could defend against it by playing queen d2, making sure after a potential sacrifice on h3, the white queen will be able to block. But now black would maintain his extra pawn and other advantages after playing e4. So, to summarize this position that we just looked at, black is better. Nevertheless, white could have put up much harder resistance than they did. But in any rate, a brilliant attacking game by Steinitz. And now let's move on to our second example that was played between William Steinitz as white and his opponent was Vasquez, and actually that game was played a year earlier than the previous one we just saw, also in Havana, Cuba in 1888. In this position, which has arisen from a French defense, black has a beautiful bishop, a very well-positioned bishop on the long diagonal, aiming right at white's king. And black immediately wanted to follow up on that and start an attack. Let's see how the game continued. Black played f5, chasing the white knight back, and immediately brought his rook to attack. This is one of those situations when one side or another decides that he or she wants to attack. Now that oftentimes can be a very risky business because, for example, in this case, by playing f5, black created a long-term weakness and target in the e6 pawn. Now in this position, white should have played differently. White should have immediately played d5, as they say so often when your opponent attacks on the side, counterattack in the center. It's a perfect illustration of that. And after d5, white would have a pretty good position. Black has some tactical issues to deal with, that for example, after the trade-off, these pawns on e6, the knight would be hanging. Also, white may have a potential for a fork if the rook recaptures on e6. And capturing on d5, of course, is not a great idea because after knight captures, it's a fork on black's rook and queen. The bishop cannot trade on d5 because that would result in another fork. So black can't really do that. Let's go back again after f5, knight e3, rook f6, d5. Probably black's best choice would be to play e5 in this position. Nevertheless, that would be quite a nice accomplishment for white because at that point the black bishop on b7 is kind of cut off from the action and is by far not as dangerous as until there is nothing in its way and it can easily paste and aim towards white's g2 pawn. Instead, in this position, Steinitz continued with rook e1, clearing the f1 square for one of his pieces to defend. Came rook h6 and knight f1. So white, as we can see, is purely on the defensive. And black is bringing one more piece to the attack, knight f6. If in this position black would have played rook to g6, white would respond by simply knight g3. Generally, when you are under attack, it's a good idea to look for ways to exchange pieces, especially queens. let's go back again to the game. After knight f1, black continued with knight to f6. And here I think white again missed an active opportunity by not playing bishop to c4, which I think should have been the correct move. And then if knight g4, then play queen d2 and try to trade queens. Again, let's go back, and in this position, Steinitz played bishop f3, trying to trade pieces. And here, black, I think, perhaps started over-pushing things. Black should have been happy to go ahead with a trade and try to use a different strategy and try to go for an endgame where black would have a superior pawn structure considering the doubled and isolated pawns that white has. Nevertheless, black also has a weakness in the e6 pawn, and therefore black's advantage, if any, is minimal. However, after what happened in the game, it was black who got in trouble in a little bit. Black played the ambitious knight e4, trying to keep pieces on the board by all cost. Another move that actually was interesting here, what would happen if black would have played knight g4 here, sacrificing the bishop on b7? Well, actually it would not have been a sound sacrifice, because after queen f2, king h1, knight h2, knight h2, queen h4, white could run away, and black does not have enough attacking pieces left to bring this attack to success. In the meantime, white has the material advantage. Black only has 2 pawns for the bishop, and at the end of the day, that would bring white the win. So let's continue with the game, where in this position, black continued with the attack by playing knight e4, trying to avoid the exchange of pieces. The problem is now that black does not have any immediate or near future threats. Steinitz played rook e3 to secure the bishop on f3 better, and black brought his second rook towards the king side. And came queen a4, trying to counterattack on the other side of the board. Here there was a tricky move, trying to play knight d2 to deflect white's knight from f1, because now if knight would take, then black would simply take the pawn and then win the rook in the corner after an exchange of bishops on f3. However, after knight d2 in this position, white can do better. Instead of capturing the knight, capture the bishop. And then after knight f1, simply take back with the king, and black's attack is over. Let's go back again. After queen a4 in the game, black continued with a5. And white simply brought another piece to the action, the rook from a1. If here black would play bishop a6, trying to get rid of the defending knight on f1, white could simply play g3, and after queen g5, play queen c6 and start putting pressure on the pawn on e6, on c7, and, perhaps just as importantly, prevent the black bishop from coming back to the long diagonal on b7. In contrary, it would not be a great idea, it would be rather risky to capture the pawn immediately on e4, because the black bishop would immediately come back with a tempo, attacking the white rook, and then when the rook moves away, would come queen g4 with the idea to getting the queen to f3 real quick, and white would be in serious trouble. So after rook went to e1, black, instead of bishop a6, continued by playing rook d8. And now it was time for white to get rid of this nice looking knight on e4 and played knight to g3. Of course, white would be more than happy to trade knights, especially considering the fact that the black bishop would be hanging after that on b7, and black still continued with the attack by playing queen h4, provoking h3, and I think here white has already a clearly better position and black kind of went overboard. Black, of course, could avoid losing the game so quickly as he did and give up on the pawn and allow white to capture on e4, but of course that would also be quite hopeless. If black right now would play f4, white would just play rook e4 and get a bishop and knight for the rook and kill black's attack completely. And this is a clearly much superior position for white. Going back to the position again, after h3, black decided to burn all bridges and sacrifice the knight on f2. If white would recapture, things actually would work out for black, because after exchange of bishops, f4 would regain the piece. Sadly for black, white has another better option here, namely capturing the bishop instead of the knight. Now, of course, black already started the attack. There is no turning back. Has to go for it all and sacrifice the knight as well. And now white is up a bishop and a knight for just 2 pawns. Of course, white's king's position is a bit open, so black has some counter chances. So after white took the knight, for example, what would happen if queen would take on h3? Well, the simplest, best move for white is to play queen c4 and then capture the pawn on e6. The best choice that black has here is to play f4 when white's most precise move is to play knight f5, using the tactical opportunity that after pawn takes knight and bishop d5, black would either get checkmated or lose significant material. Also, if in this position black would not capture the knight but play queen g5, then white could either move out of the check simply with the king or just even play rook g3 and reach a winning position. And let's go back again to the game. Black continued by playing rook g6. Black can win back one of the pieces but not both. White retreated the bishop. If now black would take the knight, white would trade rooks and then capture the pawn on e6, leaving black with not enough counterplay. Black continued in the game with rook f8, came queen c4, king h8, and now white captured another pawn, f4, white pinned the pawn, rook captured, queen d6, another strong move, rook d8. No, white did not overlook this move, even though the queen and the rook are hanging right now. White has a beautiful finishing move, rook takes f4. And now black has a back rank problem, in addition to the fact that all of their pieces are hanging as well. And therefore, black resigned. Well, I hope you enjoyed these interesting examples of attack and defense. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here it comes. And this is a beautiful composition of Stama from 1792. In this position, it's white's turn, and white seems to be in serious trouble in the fact that black is about to checkmate on h2 and g2 in just a couple of moves. But it's white's turn, and white can checkmate in 9 moves. Try to sit back and figure out a solution for yourself. And here is the solution. Knight c6 check. If king moves out, rook d8 would end the game even quicker. Black captured, rook check, king b7. Of course, white needs to make absolutely forceful moves, otherwise black will be to arrive first. And now the amazing queen sacrifice with queen takes, followed by the bishop check. And now have to deflect the black knight from f4, which is guarding the d5 square, knight d3 check, knight takes, rook check. King only has one move. Rook captures knight, king goes back, and now white is ready to play b4, king c4, and bishop d5. What a beautiful, beautiful combination. Well, hope you enjoyed this lesson, learned a bit about attack and defense, and hope to have you back. So long until then.